If you open a map of the United States and look at Arizona, one thing becomes obvious right away. It's one of the driest states in the country. In the summer, temperatures regularly climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Huge parts of the state are just desert. There's no ocean anywhere nearby. There aren't any large lakes either. Water here is considered one of the most valuable resources you can have. And at some point, millions of fish started being brought here. They were hauled in from hundreds, sometimes even thousands of miles away, not to coastal cities, not to big rivers, straight into the desert. At first glance, that sounds strange all by itself, because if you're going to work with fish, the obvious place to do it is somewhere with plenty of water, near the ocean, near large lakes, near major rivers, places where fish naturally live. But that's not what was happening here. Trucks loaded with live fish kept driving deeper and deeper into Arizona. The farther they went, the drier and emptier the roads around them became. And at some point, those trucks would end up in the middle of a landscape where there was nothing but sand, rocks, and heat. That's where the fish were unloaded. They were simply left there for months, sometimes even for a full year. And if you didn't know what was actually happening there, the whole idea would sound pretty strange. When people think about Arizona, most imagine the same thing: desert, cacti, and heat. And that's true, but only partly. Yes, most of the state is dry, but if you look at a map or satellite images, you start to notice something strange. Arizona actually has a lot of agriculture. In the middle of the desert, huge green fields suddenly appear. Circles, squares, long strips of farmland. And all of it exists for one reason: water that's brought in from somewhere else. Across the state, there's a massive network of irrigation canals. Water comes from the Colorado River, the Salt River, and the Verde River, as well as from reservoirs. From there, it's distributed across farming regions. Because of that system, farms are able to operate even in an extremely dry climate. There's also water underground. For decades, farmers have been pumping groundwater from wells to irrigate their fields. So even though the landscape looks like just desert, water is actually there. It just isn't always visible on the surface. That's why southern Arizona has long been one of the state's major farming regions. Farmers grow cotton, alfalfa, vegetables, and feed crops there. In other words, life in this region has always depended on water. But there's one important detail. All of this water is part of an artificial system. Canals, pumps, reservoirs, wells, and all that. This isn't the ocean, and it isn't a chain of natural lakes. Water has been here for a long time, but fish weren't, simply because no one really needed them. But by the middle of the 20th century, something noticeable started happening around the world. There was less and less fish in the ocean. Fishing fleets were getting bigger, fishing technology was becoming more efficient, and at some point, it became clear that the ocean couldn't keep producing larger and larger catches forever. At the same time, something else was happening. The world's population was growing rapidly, and with it, the demand for food, especially for sources of protein. Fish had always been considered one of the most accessible and healthy foods, so demand kept increasing. And that's when more and more attention started turning to aquaculture, the farming of fish. The idea itself is actually quite simple. Instead of catching fish in the ocean, you raise them the same way farmers raise chickens or sheep. By the 1970s and 1980s, these kinds of farms were starting to appear in many different countries. They were built near coastlines, along rivers, or next to lakes, places where water was already available. In the desert, though, nothing like that existed. But it turned out that a place like Arizona might actually offer some advantages compared to coastal farms. When the idea of raising fish in Arizona first appeared, it sounded pretty strange. After all, we're talking about the desert. But once people started looking closer, the region had several things that unexpectedly worked in its favor. The first one is temperature. Water here stays warm for most of the year. For many species of fish, that's a big advantage. In colder states, fish farms often run into the same problem every winter. The water cools down, and the fish grow much more slowly. Sometimes, farmers even have to heat the water artificially. In Arizona, nature does part of that work on its own. There's another thing too: land. In coastal areas or near major cities, land is usually expensive. But in southern Arizona for a long time, there were huge areas where land was plentiful and relatively cheap. That meant farmers could build large ponds and farms without the costs they would face in more densely populated regions. But the most important factor is actually underground. In many parts of the state, there are large reserves of groundwater. Farmers have been pumping it through wells for decades. In some places, this water comes up naturally warm, and in certain areas, its temperature is even influenced by geothermal heat. For raising fish, those conditions are almost ideal. And when you put all of these things together, warm water and available land, the idea that once sounded strange starts to make a lot more sense. So researchers decided to test whether fish could actually grow in a desert climate, using warm groundwater from underground sources. The results turned out to be surprisingly good, and before long, those experiments started turning into real farms right in the middle of sand, rocks, and scattered desert shrubs. They don't all look the same. Sometimes they're huge round tanks. Other times, they're long rectangular ponds. But in every case, they hold a lot of fish. A single tank can contain thousands of them. And on larger farms, the total production is measured in thousands of tons. If you look at these farms from above, you can see entire rows of ponds, one after another, sitting right in the middle of the desert landscape. The most common fish raised here is tilapia. It handles warm water well and grows quickly, which is why it's used on fish farms all over the world. Some projects also experiment with other species. One example is barramundi, a fish that normally lives in the warm waters of Australia and Southeast Asia. But the strangest part is the contrast. On one side, you have dry desert, sand, heat, and almost no natural water anywhere. On the other side, there are huge tanks filled with fish. If you see a farm like this for the first time, it almost looks unreal, like someone took a coastal fish farm and dropped it right in the middle of the desert. And it seems like it must be incredibly complicated to make it work, but the system itself is actually pretty simple. And it all starts with water underground. Wells are drilled into the ground, and pumps bring water up. That water is then directed into large tanks or ponds. Inside them, farmers create the conditions fish need to grow. The water keeps moving, oxygen is added, and the fish are fed regularly. As the fish grow, the water slowly moves through the whole system. And this is where an important detail appears. The water isn't used just once. After it passes through the fish tanks, it's used a second time. In agriculture, water that held fish ends up full of nutrients, so farmers send it out to nearby fields. That water is used to irrigate alfalfa and other feed crops. In other words, the same resource gets used twice. And in a desert, that matters a lot. Water here is too valuable to use only once. So fish farms in Arizona are designed so that every drop does as much work as possible. But there's one more thing that makes this whole system surprisingly efficient. What this really comes down to is how fish grow in the first place. When we think about farms, we usually picture cows, pigs, or chickens. Those animals constantly spend energy just keeping their bodies going. They stand, move around, and carry their own weight all the time. Fish are a little different. Fish live in water, and the water supports their bodies. They don't have to spend much energy holding up their own weight. And because of that, something important happens. More of the energy from their food goes directly into growth. Put simply, fish convert feed into body mass very efficiently. That's one of the main reasons aquaculture started growing so quickly around the world. For farmers, it means the same amount of feed can produce more food. But in Arizona, there's another factor that makes things even more interesting: water temperature. Many of the fish raised on farms prefer warm water. In colder water, they slow down. They eat less, and they grow more slowly. In southern Arizona, though, cold water is almost never a problem. For most of the year, it stays warm. That means the fish keep eating and growing almost non-stop. There aren't long, cold months when farms have to slow production. And that creates another advantage. Farmers can plan things much more precisely. They know roughly how long it will take for fish to reach market size, and they can start new batches of fish almost all year long. At that point, the picture starts to become clearer. The climate that usually makes farming difficult in the desert actually becomes an advantage here. The heat that makes the desert such a harsh place to live helps keep the water warm on fish farms. And warm water means faster fish growth. But let's go back to where this whole story started, because water is exactly the thing Arizona has always struggled with the most. Arizona is one of the driest states in the United States. Rain is rare here. Many areas receive very little precipitation throughout the year. A huge part of the state is desert. That's why water has always been one of the central issues here. Cities keep growing. The population keeps increasing. Agriculture needs more and more water for irrigation. Rivers and reservoirs are already operating close to their limits. So, in Arizona, people keep coming back to the same question again and again. Where should the water actually go? When fish farms started appearing in the state, that question came up again. And a lot of people began to doubt whether it was the right idea. Water is already hard enough to secure for farming, and now fish are being raised in the desert too. For many local residents, that sounded strange. Some argued that water in a desert should first go to cities for drinking water or to traditional crops. In their view, raising fish wasn't the most efficient way to use such a limited resource. But other experts looked at the situation a bit differently. Many fish farms use groundwater that farmers have already been pumping for agriculture for decades. And that water doesn't simply disappear after it passes through the fish tanks. It gets used a second time. After moving through the fish ponds, the water is sent to nearby fields. It's used to irrigate crops like alfalfa and other feed crops. In other words, the same water continues to move through the agricultural system instead of being used once and wasted. Still, the debate around fish farming in the desert never completely went away. In a state where every drop of water matters, any new project automatically raises questions. But over time, something else became clear. This whole idea had one advantage that almost nobody thought about at the beginning, and it had nothing to do with water. If you look at a map, Arizona is actually pretty close to several huge markets. California is the most populous state in the US, with millions of people living in cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco. Las Vegas isn't far away either, and that means something important. Fish can be raised almost right next to the people who are going to buy it. In many cases, the fish people eat in the United States comes from very far away. It's raised in countries across Asia or Latin America. Then it's frozen, loaded onto ships, and sent across the ocean. Sometimes that journey covers thousands of miles. When fish is raised in Arizona, things look very different. It can reach the market much faster. In some cases, it only takes a few hours of transport before the fish ends up in a restaurant or supermarket. That means lower transportation costs, and sometimes fewer emissions from shipping. And that leads to something pretty unexpected. A place that looks on the map like one of the driest parts of the country suddenly starts playing a role in supplying fish to major cities along the West Coast. What started as a strange experiment gradually turned into part of a real food system. The desert, a place that once seemed like one of the worst possible locations for fish, suddenly began to work as a new place to produce food. And this is where the scale of the story becomes important. The first commercial farms began appearing here in the 1980s, after successful experiments carried out by universities. Over time, an entire network of farms started developing across the state, mostly in southern Arizona, where groundwater is easier to access and the climate stays warm for most of the year. By the early 2000s, about 25 fish farms were operating in the state. Together, they produced roughly 1,300 to 1,400 tons of fish every year. Individual farms could produce hundreds of tons annually. Some operations reached 400 to 500 tons of fish per year, supplying fresh fish to restaurants and grocery stores across the western United States. At first glance, that might sound like a lot, but the reality is a little different. The United States actually produces relatively little of its own fish compared to how much seafood Americans eat. Around 70 to 80% of the seafood consumed in the US is imported from other countries. That's why even relatively small farms inside the country start to matter. And although desert aquaculture is still a fairly small industry, it shows something important. Fish don't have to be raised only where there's an ocean nearby. Sometimes they can be raised in places where you wouldn't even expect to see water at all. And if you look at Arizona again today, the landscape still looks the same. Desert, heat, cacti. But somewhere out in that landscape, there are farms where thousands of tons of fish grow every year in tanks and ponds.